Good morning, everyone, and good evening to our audience joining from Korea and Japan. Welcome to GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIX. I'm Yeonho Kim, Associate Director at GWIX. And thank you for joining our Korea Policy Forum. The forum is part of the policy program at GWIX, focusing on discussing current Korea-related policy issues in the domestic, regional, and global context. And today's forum is co-sponsored by the East Asia National Resource Center. Today, we will discuss the trilateral relations among the U.S., Korea, and Japan in the post-Abe era. Seoul and Tokyo have gone through a turbulent period of time following the Korean Supreme Court's ruling in 2018 on the compensation of victims of wartime forced labor. And we have seen bilateral trade disputes that spilled over to security cooperation and trilateral relations. And Japan's new Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga inherited the ongoing challenges from his predecessor Shinzo Abe. Although both Tokyo and Seoul are not willing to change their existing policy lines in the short run, the political need for a refreshed approach to the bilateral relations would emerge as both countries struggle with the unprecedented challenges in the COVID-19 pandemic, and the results of the U.S. Elections next week could be another momentum. And I'm very delighted to have four distinguished speakers to cover these issues from different perspectives. Let me briefly introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Celeste Arrington, Korea Foundation Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at GW. She specializes in comparative politics with a regional focus on the Koreas and Japan. She is the author of Accidental Activists, Victims and Government Accountability in South Korea and Japan. Our next speaker is Emma Chanlett Avery, a specialist in Asian affairs at the Congressional Research Service. She is a member of the Mansfield Foundation U.S.-Japan Network for the Future, Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees of the Japan-America Society of Washington, and the 2016 recipient of the Cato Prize. Yong-Chul Ha is a Korea Foundation Professor at the Jackson School of International Studies, University of Washington. He is also Professor Emeritus of Seoul National University, and he is the author of The Dynamics of a Strong State, and currently finishing a book on late industrialization, the state and social change in a comparative perspective. And last but not least, James Schoff is a senior fellow in the Carnegie Asia program. He served as senior advisor for East Asia policy at the U.S. Office of the Secretary of Defense. And James' publications include Uncommon Alliance for the Common Good, the United States and Japan after the Cold War. And with that, let me turn it over to Celeste.
Thank you very much, Yono and Mine, for organizing this, and it's a pleasure to join the three other panelists this morning. I'd like to offer a brief elaboration of how we got to these unprecedentedly strained Japan-South Korea relations. And in particular, I want to front load my comments this morning with giving you a preview of what I want to argue. So I want to make three interrelated points in my brief remarks here. And the first is that the courts and the processes of litigation over historical grievances are deeply intertwined with politics. So even though both countries, Japan and South Korea, value judicial independence, and the judiciary operates by very different rules and incentive structures than politics, it's very difficult to fully disentangle politics from the judicial process in these cases. And in part that is because of multi-sided activism involving litigation by the plaintiffs, like the plaintiffs in these forced labor cases. But in addition, the comfort women or former sex slaves and a number of other groups of people who are trying to find redress for the grievances that they allegedly suffered under Japanese colonial rule over the Korean Peninsula. And through the decades of litigation and activism of such individuals, we've seen the building of a potent mobilizational structure, and that's my second point today. The movement for historical redress from Japan is very developed in Korea, and it has also sparked a increasingly developed backlash, sort of an anti-Korean, if you will, movement in Japan. And that leads me to my third point, which is that the leaders of Japan and South Korea, because of these mobilizational infrastructures that have developed, have fewer and fewer incentives to compromise or to reconcile, including with this new Prime Minister, Suga Yoshihide. There are signs, however, that neither leader is willing to go too far, and that they can take steps back from the brink, if you will, but still the incentives for compromising and reconciliation remain low in both countries. So if we step back to sort of the proximate cause of the current deterioration in bilateral relations, that is the Supreme Court rulings from the Korean Supreme Court in fall 2018. These landmark rulings rejected the Japanese Supreme Court rulings that had found that the Japanese firms were not liable for forced laborers. In these rulings, the Korean Supreme Court went beyond the question of legal liability and argued basically that the entire colonial rule was unlawful. And in so doing, they reopened a dispute that had been set aside in the bilateral normalization treaty between Japan and South Korea in 1965 over the legal nature of the annexation treaties through which the Korean Peninsula became part of the Japanese Empire in 1910. These rulings came on top of an already precarious bilateral relationship, which had been strained after the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement. This deal was particularly controversial in South Korea. And as a result, after the President Park Geun-hye, who reached the deal with Japan, was impeached in 2017, all of the candidates for the presidency to replace her had pledged to review the deal. Indeed, when Moon Jae-in was elected in 2017 to the presidency of South Korea, his administration reviewed the deal and kept it, but then shortly after the Supreme Court rulings in fall 2018 announced that he would be closing the Foundation for Reconciliation and Healing, which was dispersing Japanese government money to the surviving comfort women. As a result of that announcement, you had increasing distrust between Japan and South Korea. And this is just to give you a sense of how controversial the deal was in South Korea. Some 76 to 86% of South Koreans after the deal, in particular, opposed the part about relocating this infamous statue. In addition, the courts in South Korea seized the assets of Japanese firms in South Korea in January 2019 in order to begin the process of paying the plaintiffs in response to the Supreme Court rulings that the Japanese firms were liable to pay. Most of those plaintiffs had passed away, but the process of seizing assets of Japanese firms in South Korea further strained relations. Tensions escalated in summer 2019, where you had Japan deciding to impose export restrictions on materials that South Korea needed for LCD-related products. And the government of Japan argued this was not a retaliatory move against the Supreme Court rulings, but Koreans widely perceived this as retaliation. What was clearly retaliatory was the South Korean move to take Japan off of its white list of trusted trading partners in July 2019, and then announced that it would be withdrawing from GSOMIA, which is a bilateral military intelligence sharing agreement. This withdrawal from GSOMIA, or the announcement of the withdrawal from GSOMIA, surprised many, and it also firmly linked, as Yono mentioned, security, history, and economics to an unprecedented degree. That decision to withdraw from GSOMIA, the Moon Jae-in administration suspended 3 months later, and there was a summit meeting between then Prime Minister Abe and Moon Jae-in. However, little progress was made. In addition, the South Korean speaker Moon Hee-sang proposed a joint fund to help move toward resolution of these Supreme Court rulings. But the Blue House, the Moon Jae-in administration, seemed uninterested, and the Japanese government also refused it. So we entered 2020, just before COVID hit, with continued distrust between the two relations. It wasn't as bad as summer 2019, but the distrust was deep, and the asset seizure process continued to percolate through the courts. However, COVID-19 took over as a priority for both governments. The history question continued to fester under the surface. More broadly, public opinion polls show that mutual antipathy between Japanese and Koreans was quite high. This is a joint poll between Gendon and Pyo and East Asia Institute that they've done over the last since 2013. The pink line shows among Japanese respondents those who held very bad or relatively bad opinions of Korea, and the purple line shows Korean respondents holding those feelings about Japan. In addition, the Japanese public opinion polls show increasing what's been called Korea fatigue as a result of this these sustained tensions in bilateral relations. And in 2019, December, the Cabinet Office survey found that so close to 3/4% of Japanese held negative views of South Korea. Here in September, Japan got a new prime minister. Prime Minister Suga had been the chief cabinet secretary under Abe for 8 years, and therefore in that position had been directly involved with dealing with Korea and responding to Korea for years. He continued to emphasize Japan's consistent position, and earlier this week in his first policy speech declared Korea was very important as a neighbor, but that Seoul should take appropriate actions to restore Japan-South Korea relations. In short, the ball, according to Japan, is in Korea's court, and Korea must make the first move. Also in President Moon's congratulatory call to Prime Minister Suga upon his assumption of the prime ministership, Suga apparently told Moon Jae-in that he should not let the court-ordered liquidation of Japanese firms in Korea's assets to go ahead. Moon Jae-in has insisted since fall 2018 that he cannot interfere in the judiciary. This is not entirely true, but the forced labor cases have a difficult domestic political baggage in South Korea. They were revealed after Park Geun-hye's impeachment to be part of a political favor exchange between the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and President Park Geun-hye. So the Supreme Court stalled ruling on these cases in order to receive political favors from Park Geun-hye. So besides being diplomatically complicated cases, they're also domestically very complicated political cases. As one observer said, the rulings from the Supreme Court in 2018 were a declaration of independence by the judiciary, which has been in the past ridiculed as a servant of power, meaning to the presidency in South Korea. Meanwhile, the ruling party's leader, Lee Na-gyun, has been eager to move forward with relations on Japan, but we haven't seen anything concrete. And Prime Minister Suga has apparently told Moon Jae-in that he will not attend the Trilateral Summit between South Korea, Japan, and China unless South Korea somehow guarantees that the assets of Japanese firms in Korea will not be liquidated. So you get a sense here from this chronology that how central the court cases remain. They are a key sticking point, especially the liquidation of the assets is a key sticking point between Japan and South Korea. So if I just could close with the 3 takeaways that I opened with. right now we have this question of whether Japan-South Korea relations. And in my research, I've been drawing on a literature that talks about the radiating effects of courts, that the courts are not just about the final rulings, but the process of adjudication, and the activism around the courts also has ripple effects into politics, and politics likewise into the courts. And here it's not just about the final rulings, of which there have been very few in favor of the plaintiffs. Actually, there have been more than 100 cases over historical claims against against Japan, sorry, but very few positive rulings from the plaintiff's perspective. In the meantime, these activism around historical grievances has built up movements and the infrastructure associated with them. The activists of, say, like the forced laborers and their lawyers have become go-to non-governmental sources for media, which encourages extensive media coverage of these issues, and that media coverage then cultivates public support in Korea, which in turn makes it more difficult for leaders like President Moon to push for compromise if he were actually willing to do so. In addition, these lawsuits have uncovered evidence of past abuses, and similarly have catalyzed initiatives like the Truth Commission for Forced Labor in South Korea, which has uncovered evidence of up to 200,000 cases of forced labor by 300 Japanese firms. So the potential for further litigation exists there. These lawsuits and the activism around them have also led to legislation in South Korea. They've to provide financial assistance for former victims of Japan. And so you see this mutually constitutive effect between the judicial sphere and the political sphere in terms of building support for the victims. At the same time, these lawsuits have exposed the ambiguities in past agreements and have revealed just how complex dealing with this history is. There are some finding documents to support the claims. It's very difficult. So for example, earlier this year in January, only one of the 64 plaintiffs in forced labor was able to get compensation for past unpaid wages through the courts in Korea, because the courts ruled that there was not evidence for the other 63 plaintiffs to get paid. And finally, I think the leaders, because of this growing infrastructure of movements for historical justice, have fewer domestic political incentives to compromise or to reconcile. So these issues are far from over. That said, I think there are signs that the two governments can walk back from the brink, even if it's not fully compromising. And the liquidation of Japanese firms' assets in Korea is a good example of this. They seem to be paused. They were supposed to be liquidated in August, and yet we haven't seen that actually happen. And in this pause, I think there is room for both leaders to show leadership. Whether we're actually going to see that happen, I am not optimistic. And I'll just close there and turn it over to my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Celeste. And I asked both Emma and Young-Choo to discuss the domestic politics and the trilateral relations in Japan and Korea, respectively. So Emma, did you want to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this. Thanks to Celeste for providing that helpful overview of just how far into the toilet relations between Japan and South Korea have fallen. Because this is a public event, I also have to issue a disclaimer that these views are only my own that I'm expressing here, but delighted to do so, and I will fill in some of my perspective around Celeste's on how things are going in Japan. Obviously, we're pretty new into the Suga administration. It was also somewhat sudden that he came into power, so there's a little bit of guesswork going on here. But in general, I think that Suga is not known for his forceful foreign policy views, particularly compared to his predecessor, Shinzo Abe, who really made Japan into a bigger international player, and certainly foreign policy was among his priorities. Suga appears to be more focused on domestic issues, particularly reform and this digital agency, but has pledged to have continuity, basically, with Shinzo Abe's foreign policy. Now, in the meantime, of course, he has major crises to deal with in Japan, controlling the outbreak, dealing with the pandemic globally, rebuilding Japan's economy as a result of the fallout from the pandemic. So he has quite a bit on his plate. That said, there's a question about whether there's any sort of a chance for a reset, particularly with relations with South Korea. When I was, spent years looking at this relationship between South Korea and Japan, and it didn't seem that there was particular suspicion from Seoul on Abe himself, based on past associations, based on past statements that he had made. So in my mind, I was thinking maybe we can get past this rough period of relations between Japan and South Korea after Abe. Right now, I mean, I sort of echo Celeste. I'm not terribly optimistic, though, that under Moon and Suga, that there's a chance for any sort of reconciliation. There's also probably a little bit of difficulty for Suga to take a different approach to South Korea based on his own domestic policies, based on his own domestic politics, and trying to maintain the support that he had. To my mind, one of the most important legacies that Abe has is stability in keeping the same prime minister in power, as opposed to a revolving door of prime ministers in Japan, which made policy making and building long-term agreements really difficult with Japan. So to the extent that Suga wants to be also a stabilizing force without getting voted out the next chance, he may not have the bandwidth, the flexibility to take any sort of a bold approach towards South Korean relations. As Celeste mentioned, the indications so far are not particularly promising. His, saying he was not going to visit South Korea if without a guarantee that the seized assets will not be liquidated. He has said he will not attend the Trilateral Forum among China, South Korea, and Japan. So it doesn't look like he's striking out anyway. He's also he and Abe, I believe, attended the funeral of Megumi Yakota's father in the last week. So it seems like he'll take the same position on North Korea policy, which interplays with his policy with South Korea as well. I also want to just point out that I think Jim's going to talk at more length about the U.S. position here, but there's a lot of talk now about this revival of the so-called quadrilateral security dialogue, which is the U.S., India, Australia, and Japan. We can talk about that if you want to, and I have some skepticism that's going to go very far. But that sort of presents this alternative to Japan to dealing with the United States outside. So that excludes at this point at least South Korea from participating in that, and gives them another bilateral arena in which to play. We don't know whether a new administration in the United States will change these dynamics. Under the Obama administration, there was a lot of pressure on Japan and South Korea to reconcile their differences, or at least set them aside, so that there could be more effective trilateral engagement. The Trump administration has been less focused on multilateralism in its orientation. and I don't think this pressure has been there. We've seen a lot of key personnel positions left unfilled for long periods of time. There's some criticism that there was neglect, really, of even paying attention to the developing antipathy between Seoul and Korea. So things like the threat to withdraw from the GSOMIA information sharing agreement sort of took Washington by surprise, and they didn't really get involved until the last minute. So there's some question about whether a renewed focus on multilateral institutions and multi and trilateral engagement would become more to the fore under a Biden administration. I think that the outlook for the short term is not particularly strong for many of the reasons that Celeste laid out here. But we're certainly living in uncertain times, so perhaps there could be some sort of a jolt that could restart relations, and that's about as promising a note as I can leave it at this point. Look forward to questions from the audience and from my fellow panelists after this. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you for concluding your remarks with a little bit optimistic elements. And Young-Chul, yeah, thank you. Young-Chul, you're next.
Thank you very much for inviting me. In any case, because of somehow off and on bad connections, I could not, clearly understand what the previous two speakers did, although I basically understood. Particularly PPT was very detailed. It was good updating, particularly for me, who has not been closely following daily events. So I appreciate the presentation. So almost everything else already sort of said. I want to point out, I want to make a few points on each level: bilateral, regional, and multilateral. On the bilateral, I think all these complicated issues, setting that aside, what I want to say is that somehow the relationship between Japan and Korea is almost like the marriage in crisis. In other words, whether any mediator will succeed in the rehabilitating relationship, or just go to court and then sort of finalize all the divorce kind of thing. But from that perspective, somehow any bad spousal relationship, mutual understanding is an issue. My understanding is that somehow the sort of geographical proximity doesn't help too much to understand each other very well. In fact, somehow they take so much for granted, as if they know each other very well. But to my mind, somehow, for example, the revival of the divisionism in Japanese historical perspective under Abe sort of has been preventing the Japan side from fully understanding what has happened in South Korean politics and society and culture. I think somehow we should make an effort to eliminate this kind of cognitive barriers in mutual understanding. Having said that, what is so more specifically, somehow Japan now seems to have reached a sort of understanding that their sudden shift in their foreign policy, sort of using economic measure for political purposes, somehow has not brought much success this time. Also on the part of Korea, now finally they thought, oh, now they could survive without Japan. I think this most recent change in the mutual perceptions based upon actual foreign policies, to me, will be affecting the future relationship between the two countries. And to make it short, in terms of regional level, I think now also, since nothing much going on about North Korean nuclear issues, somehow Japan, I mean, revolving around the Korean Peninsula, nothing much to do at the point. Also, even on the part of South Korea, somehow the regime is more or less disposed to nationalism more strongly than earlier the points. So even at the regional level, I don't see much the sort of a base to say there's going to be, you know, enlivened new relationship developing between the two countries. But most important, I want to go on to the multilateral relationship involving the United States. Here, certainly distinctly different approaches between the two countries toward the United States, or perception of the United States. On the part of South Korea, more nationalistic once again, but then somehow within South Korean society now sort of diverging opinions has begun to develop in terms of how to perceive of the United States. Particularly, I think it's very important to understand how the world and the region would perceive of the United States in the post-pandemic crisis. So my guess is that somehow the perception of the United States will, if not dramatically, will greatly change in the pandemic, the world or regional situation. In the meantime, I think to me, for both Japan and Korea, the 70-some years of the alliance, basically secret dependency on the United States, to me is abnormal, truly abnormal, and then it needs to be sort of rethought, retooled, or reoriented. In other words, it's not so much about anti-Americanism or the anti-US. It's more about to what extent Japan and Korea will go for their autonomous status in the regional or international context. So how the United States would accommodate this kind of changing perceptions and then changing sort of a move on the part of both Korea and Japan. In other words, what the United States has not understood very well is about South Korean democracy on my part. In other words, somehow because of these domestic squabbles developing on a daily basis in South Korea, somehow the US seems to have discounted the importance of a South Korean democratic development. That's why even particularly salient under the Trump administration, somehow no efforts to build on alliance relationship based on values, particularly democracy. Behind this kind of orientation, not only about US isolationism, but more about sort of poor understanding or even maybe lack of understanding of South Korean democracy. I think these things also applies to Japan. Japan doesn't seem to understand how much Korean society has changed. From my perspective, what is going on in South Korea is the only country in East Asia where they are trying to sort of synthesize the Western value and institution with South Korean the way of the economic development. So it's not an easy task. We should not focus too much on daily kind of problems. More, we should take a longer term perspective in order to facilitate democratic values of the region as well as the world. In other words, South Korea is a better example for the US to use in dealing with the rest of the world in terms of spreading their own universal values. Having said that, I think in this context, Japan's under Abe, South Korean value actually dramatically devalued. For example, by the time of 2015, somehow the Japan stopped mentioning South Korea as an important country based on value consensus or strategic the importance. Somehow they dropped the South Korea as the partner or as the invaluable partner in sharing basic values and institutions. At the same time, even they dropped the word the most the important neighborly the countries and then culturally closed country. I mean the nation. So the Abe's big power policy, diplomacy, in conjunction with the U.S. support, somehow has tended to devalue the strategic importance of South Korea. I don't know. I'm not sure whether or how far the new regime Suga will the change or the make any the efforts to change this kind of basic Japanese the strategic policy. So not only in the near term, but also in the middle long term, the somehow unless until the Japanese position has not changed, I don't see much prospect for improvement in the upcoming relationship. But having said that, however, the South Korea may try to show some sign of sort of face-saving kind of a gesture to Japan to make this upcoming trilateral summit meeting successful. For example, as Celeste mentioned, maybe South Korean government may put up the kind of diplomatic agenda by saying we're willing to discuss about new formula or suggest a new formula, particularly following Moon Jae-ing's formula, so that they want to try to make an effort to make this upcoming summit meeting successful. But overall, I think in North Asia, I really think that the big shift has just started. China is rising. Japan now wants to become more autonomous. South Korea now try to project their own influence, not only to North Korea, but to the rest of the region. So this entire region is in flux. And then the United States actually should realize it's not about anti-US or anti-Americanism. It's more about sort of a new era that's just start emerging in North Korea, in North Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Young-Chil. I think he just raised a couple of questions that other panelists may want to respond, and I promise we'll have time for the discussions among the panelists before we open it up to Q&A. And next, James Schoff, I asked him to discuss a U.S. view of the trilateral relations. James?
Well, thank you very much, Young-Ho. It's great to be with you. Thank you for the invitation and great to be with all the panelists. I'm going to start off with a couple of basic kind of personal observations, three observations. Number one, that trilateral cooperation is in all three countries' national interests. Number two, that trilateralism is not a means for adjudicating bilateral differences, but I do think it can facilitate communication, and I'll talk about a specific example in a second. Number three, trilateral cooperation can be a safe haven from bilateral friction, but only if all three coordinate messaging toward that end. So I'll take each of these in turn. So in terms of national interests, trilateral cooperation is not the only answer to all of the country's strategic problems and objectives, but I think it's a very important one. It started primarily around coordinating policy vis-a-vis North Korea, and that remains critically important today, especially now that North Korea is a fully fledged nuclear power and a family dictatorship continuing there. The shared values of democracy that Professor mentioned and commitment to human rights and market economy are still very important, and particularly important now in the face of China's rise, Chinese pressure in areas of norm building, especially in Asia, if we take it in a regional context. And this applies to technology development, new rules governing data transfers, data access. There's a whole new horizon of the digital economy that the three countries, the U.S., Japan, and Korea, really have some shared interests in cooperation. resisting Chinese coercion, the THAAD missile defense example, where China was using its economic power to pressure individual countries. I think we need to see good trilateral cooperation on that front. The U.S., the alliances that we have, the military alliances that we have, give us the most opportunities to train together. We have high levels of interoperability in the platforms and the systems that we utilize in missile defense, anti-submarine warfare, non-proliferation, crisis management, dealing with regional financial or natural disasters, technology development, health cooperation, protecting the environment, the oceans. These are all greatly facilitated by our three countries' cooperation. So it's not exclusive to our three countries. Other countries are obviously involved in that, but I think this is a uniquely capable combination. So on the second point, I don't think the US wants to or can really effectively take sides in the disputes between Japan and South Korea, but I do think we can facilitate communication. And one particular concrete example, it was mentioned by some of the previous panelists, that there were reports in the Japanese press, at least, that were attributed anonymously to an anonymous foreign ministry official that Prime Minister Suga would not travel to Seoul for the trilateral meeting, China, Japan, South Korea, unless there was some kind of guarantee that the assets would not be liquidated. This was reported as kind of like not ever liquidating the assets. But my understanding, talking to people on the fringes of these actual conversations, suggests that what the foreign ministry is trying to elicit from the South Korean side is some promise that assets will not be liquidated while the prime minister is in South Korea, or the day before, or the day after he returns from Seoul. So that's actually an important difference. It's really just about face saving and trying to have a political conversation or a constructive conversation. The level of trust between the two is so low that this kind of request seems necessary to them. But of course, on the South Korean side, they can't be seen as somehow giving a guarantee that they're not going to do something that's a process that's going forward in the courts. So here's a classic dilemma of lack of trust, somewhat poor communication, concerns that one side might say something or do something that makes the other look bad, and they're kind of frozen in this position. So right now, actually, the Director General Takizaki from Japan's foreign ministry is in Seoul. Right now, he'll be there for 3 days to have discussions about a variety of things, but I expect this is one of those key areas. This is where I think the US being in the room, being a part of the process, actively fostering trilateral communication and coordination can actually help bridge that trust gap, because they both know that the US is in the room hearing what they're saying, and we can work together. And I think this applies to a wide range of policies and different types of cooperation. And then finally, the safe haven idea. I've seen this work when I was in the Pentagon. I was responsible for the defense trilateral talks at an action officer level. And this is when North Korea shelled Yeongyang-do and the Chonan was attacked, and a variety of other situations. And the trilateral cooperation was really important and actually flourished during this time, even as there were bilateral differences between Japan and South Korea, because the leaders could kind of separate the other. They're not giving up their dedication to resolving the bilateral problems or giving up some kind of sovereignty in the process. But I think what they're doing is they're saying that's the bilateral conversation is the bilateral conversation, and we're going to continue pressing that. But trilateral is different, and that's for our national interest and for our strategic interests. So we should be able to pursue that and not run everything through the bilateral process. Unfortunately, I have not, as been alluded to in the other presentations, I have not seen a successful political settlement to these very difficult historical issues and perspectives. The agreement on the comfort women hasn't been sustained. Government organized academic panels over the years have not bridged these history gaps. Even the Kim-Obuchi Summit, the action plan of 1998, which was supposed to kind of help put the relationship on a better trajectory has not succeeded as hoped. Ultimately, I don't think politicians are going to be able to address these issues. So I would rather see a more of a focus on the non-governmental areas, education, exchange, business, all these other areas of deepening mutual understanding of what happened during that time in their history, and playing a long game of reconciliation and taking some of the politics out of this. But because that's not going to fix anything anytime soon, I think what's really important is diversifying the connections and avoid driving bilateral relations down the roads that are most blocked. I mean, if the reports that Suga will not go to Seoul because he wants a guarantee of a compromise by Seoul before he even goes, to me, that's if that's true, that's very self-defeating, because you're driving all the bilateral energy and activity down the road that is most blocked. And that happened during the Park administration as well. Abe and Park hardly met at all. So I would expand the relationship into other areas that have been addressed, into environment, digital transformation, healthcare, cooperation in space. The idea being that when there are problems, and I think we will see further intensification of this, some liquidation of assets will happen. There will be some retaliation by Japan on this front. But if that happens, it's only one part of a larger relationship, and it needs to be dealt with, but it doesn't seize up the entire relationship in that regard. And then the public opinion version, as Celeste showed in her charts, it's less a slave to that the historical aspect of the bilateral relationship, and hopefully people will see all these other aspects of the relationship that can be positive, so that it's not all one thing or the other. Just finally, to wrap up, I think from a U.S. perspective, deterrence vis-a-vis North Korea primarily, but also Chinese maritime expansion, military coercion, economic coercion. Deterrence vis-a-vis those activities is really important and is best served by trilateral cooperation. And the point is not to isolate or intimidate or punish the other countries. It's really there to deny any benefit from any aggressive action by the others. So that's the way of keeping peace and keeping stability most effectively, in my opinion. We must avoid a nuclear exchange with North Korea. We must, and I think we can facilitate engagement with North Korea via inter-Korean relations, with the support of Japan and the United States, supporting that kind of targeted sanctions, exemptions, perhaps in the case of inter-Korean projects or engagement. So I think there's some opportunities on the trilateral front. We're talking about this in a post-Abe world, but clearly the big question hanging over us is will we be in a post-Trump environment relatively soon? Either way, some of these problems are not going to be quickly solved, but I think you'll see a more willing partner in the United States in the trilateral arena, and then also in the regional multilateral arena. The Quad is still, as Emma mentioned, is a real challenge, because I think we just heard a speech from a Korean professor the other day that the Quad, if bringing South Korea into the Quad, would essentially make South Korea an enemy of China in the view of Beijing, and so that would be problematic. So how we manage that kind of relationship? South Korea has a unique position vis-a-vis China, being so close. And then the issue of human rights and North Korean human rights. We could see a bigger push on that, perhaps from a Biden administration. And this is part of our shared values, but the Moon administration has been less aggressive in pursuing that particular line of complaint vis-a-vis North Korea. So there are a lot of areas that we have friction and different perspectives that need to be accommodated. And here, I think Professor Ha is right in terms of we need to accommodate each other's special positions. But I still think the trilateral piece is vitally important. So I'm hoping we can continue to press on that in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So I think we have around 10 minutes for the discussions among the panelists before we open it up to Q&A. Emma, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Just something I think that Jim said, and I think he already sort of answered it, but this notion of a safe haven, being able to separate bilateral differences in order to cooperate in a trilateral way. I mean, that's obviously just been sort of turned on its head between Seoul and Tokyo now. I mean, everything is converged together, right? Retaliation across the spectrum. If there's a trade dispute, or if there's a history dispute or a legal dispute, it sort of is pushed into a trade retaliation move. So it's unfortunately like a uniquely counterproductive way to engage. And we've seen, we've seen them be able to do this in other ways. I mean, just think about, Japan and China for a long time, their economic relations, and you could even argue until today, were sort of a main ballast, against, against more tension arising from history issues. They've been able to do that. But there is something about this, hostility and historical baggage between Japan and South Korea that makes it really hard to get past that. It's unfortunate.
Yes, Jim.
Well, thank you. I just thought I'd respond to a couple of the questions I see in the Q&A. There's a lot of good questions in there. And one of those asked about this visit by Director General Takazaki, who's in Seoul now, and what can we expect from that? I think this is really potentially important because you don't get too many opportunities in a new administration. This is really the chance, the window to reset to some extent, or at least stabilize the relationship. And they got off to a tough start with this, I think, this misunderstanding about the guarantee and Suga's visit. So in a sense, they can turn this around as a bridge building opportunity if they can manage through diplomacy to satisfy each other and have Suga have a successful trip as part of this trilateral. So what I hope we see out of this meeting is nothing, is no kind of comments back and forth, demands. I came here to get this, and so what I'm hoping is that it's a very quiet meeting to be followed up by an actual visit by Prime Minister Suga. If we see that, then I think they've taken advantage of that trust building opportunity. Otherwise, we've seen plenty of examples in the past where very soon after a bilateral consultation, you get two different readouts of what was actually said, and that's clearly a tough sign. There was another question on North Korea policy in the new Suga administration, and here, I think one of the big factors is going to be who wins the election in the United States as well, and how North Korea responds to that. So there's so many dynamics, but I think if North Korea is testing nuclear weapons and testing ICBMs, that puts us in a whole different arena of policy coordination and kind of deterrence focus. But if there's a holding off of that and a chance for re-engagement, I think Japan will be interested in being a part of or supporting engagement with North Korea. Hopefully that they feel like they'd rather be better coordinated with on the policy choices than happened in the Trump administration. But I think they see opportunities there.
Yes. Emma, and then Celeste.
Quickly on responding to Jim's last point, unfortunately, I think that when North Korea behaves really badly and there are provocations, that has actually been the most effective driver of trilateral cooperation that we've seen historically. So if North Korea is suddenly, doing things that, can't be, what's the right way to say this? That South Korea is forced to also condemn those activities, that at least gives sort of like a common platform for the United States and Japan and South Korea to, issue a joint statement among foreign ministers or something. And I think that's particularly true if we see a Biden administration with a more emphasis on rejuvenating these bilateral alliances. It's the trouble in trilateral coordination over North Korea policy is when North Korea is actually engaging, because then all these national interests actually come to the fore, and you don't find the same level of consensus. If they're shooting up ICBMs and testing nuclear weapons, that gives something a little more concrete to agree among those three countries.
Just quick follow-up. I understand Prime Minister Abe was really committed to solving the abductee issues. He took it very personal. And I wonder, compared to Abe, how strongly, the new Prime Minister Suga is committed to solving this particular issue. If Japan has kind of opening window of opportunity.
Sure. I mean, as I said, I think Suga did make this effort to go to one of the most famous abductees' father's funeral this past week, despite it being a smallish affair because of COVID restrictions. But I don't think that you probably wouldn't argue that he's more committed to it than Abe. Abe really, hitched his start to this issue when he was chief cabinet secretary. So I think he was sort of uniquely committed to this abductee issue. I haven't seen that, just partly because we don't know Suga as well, that that would be the absolute priority for him. But to the extent that he's pledging continuity with Abe's foreign policy, it may be similar. The other panelists may have other views on that.
Yes, Celeste and Young Chuk.
Thanks. I agree with Emma on this. Just to say, if there's an infrastructure of social movements for historical redress in South Korea, the abductees infrastructure is very strong in Japan, and so the political incentives for Suga to abandon the abductions issue are minuscule, if not zero. And so for him to shore up political clout in Japan domestically, I think he will continue to prioritize the abductions issue. I think in terms of optics and messaging, Jim mentioned the communication, the idea that Suga is willing to meet with North Korea without any conditions, and yet there appears to be this condition to meet with South Korea. That difference did not play well among South Koreans, and I think certainly gets to what Emma and Jim were talking about earlier in terms of the challenges of disentangling history from economics, from security relations, and pursuing multilateral cooperation without a resolution to the history question.
Yeah, basically, I also agree with the other two panelists. I think the abduction issue is a very serious issue in Japan, not only for domestic purposes, but also for bargaining sort of chip in dealing with North Korea. In fact, as you remember, this abduction issue was a very critical factor for Japanese, the six-party talk negotiation. But then more about future, I think the question now is, to what extent the three countries of the United States, South Korea, and Japan share on the nature of the threat, nuclear threat from North Korea. In fact, as you remember, under the Obama administration, 5 years or 4 years just passed away without making much progress under the so-called strategic patience. I used to say there's no strategy, only patience. In the meantime, the assumption of collapse, possible collapse, never realized in North Korea. So then I think probably the Japan feels most threatened by North Korean nuclear, nuclear weapons or the delivery capacity. surprisingly, South Korea actually, we are probably so immune to North Korean threats, so they may not feel as strong as even the Japanese about this. But then, North Korean nuclear issue is not only about technical nuclear issue for Japan. It's more political in that I think that whenever some room opens up, Japan, I think, will jump on to negotiate with North Korea as a way of establishing their sense of autonomy in diplomacy. As we all remember, the U.S. The possible, sort of a complaint about U.S. Dealing with China back in 1970s. So I really think that the Japan probably more serious about North Korean nuclear issues. Why? As soon as some progress made in that department, I think that Japan is probably is more eager than any other country to have some sort of negotiation starting with North Korea. Having said that, however, after the U.S. election, how to perceive of North Korea, particularly in terms of nuclear threat capabilities, that's going to be new discussion, I expect, because my sense is that there is a strong sort of North Korean nuclear fatigue somehow. In other words, between the kind of step-by-step or comprehensive approach, probably everybody seems to be leaning toward the more or less some sort of compromise, if not closer to North Korean demands. I think Trump administration made a good progress in their perception of North Korea, comparatively speaking, quite different, opposite to Bush or earlier on. That is, they for the first time tried to link North Korean systemic issue with the denuclearization. I hope that spirit should continue, unless until we combine the strategy of denuclearization between this kind of technical side and then North Korean systemic issue. We're not going to resolve it. But having said this having made this kind of broad statements, more specifically, I think the political value, the political value of the North Korean nuclear issue has dramatically decreased, particularly because of pandemic crisis. So it's an opportune time for the three countries or two countries to be more serious about North Korea denuclearization, when North Korea is much more desperate than previous times.
Thank you. So let me start with the first question we have here. So it's from Scott Seaman. What are the chances that seized Japanese assets are liquidated, and when might that happen?
My understanding is that they were supposed to be liquidated in August, and then that decision was appealed. And so we're still waiting for the courts. I don't know a specific date on that. Mark Mannion asked a question about to what extent the Moon administration can influence the court process. And I think, as Jim mentioned earlier, the Moon administration could signal through its rhetoric to slow down that process, or even submit a formal document to the courts regarding the adjudication procedures. But as Jim and Emma also mentioned earlier, this process will at some point come to an end. And for the Moon administration to slow down in the schedule of the courts smacks too much of the Park Geun-hye administration, which was impeached previously. And so I'm not sure that the Moon administration is that eager to weigh in on the court process. And so the question, I think, is, as the other panelists have alluded to, can the Japanese government and the South Korean political and the administration sort of separate out the history issue and move forward on, say, having a trilateral talk without letting the liquidation of assets affect every other dimension of the relationship.
Thank you. Young-Chul, do you have any comments?
I want to go back to the probably very important sort of a question about developmental model of both South Korea and Japan. And in some most recent, the sort of a monograph by the Japanese scholar, I forgot her name, and talk about the importance of Japanese development model as a tool for Japanese political economic decision making or foreign policy. I also have been following, I mean, sort of not closely, but just took a glance at the State Department, Secretary Pompeo's schedule. Everywhere, I mean, any country, any place he landed on talking about the Indo-Pacific and then the democracy value or something like that, then do you think that is it so realistic to extend or apply U.S. model of democracy and the capitalism to the rest of the world? By now, U.S. should realize it's not possible. It's unrealistic to expect it. Then what are the realistic possibilities? Either Korean model or Japanese model. That should be the model that the United States foreign policymakers should consider very seriously. I really think that I have seldom heard the U.S. side mention the South Korea as an exemplar of the democratization whenever Pompeo visit some countries. Why? I mean, if U.S. Takes South Korea as a kind of cross ally, South Korea has been or should be regarded as the most successful case of U.S. foreign policy. But then, how does that factor into U.S. foreign policy making? Somehow, this can perfunctory reference to democracy value to Central Asia, for example. Do you think does it make sense? I don't think it makes any sense at all. So the how to take. I mean, if indeed the U.S. rather than sort of being critical over sort of being aloof of South Korea's foreign policy stance, also given this kind of too frequent meetings between Korea and Seoul in Washington D.C. belt area, maybe several tens of times per year, what new idea has come out of it, rather than just a meeting personal context? I think it is time to think about for the U.S. to think about how to take advantage of your successful diplomatic case in your foreign policy consideration.
Thank you. Next question from Jada Fraser with CSIS. Let me just take one question from this attendee. So, to what extent do you see MEC's role? I think it refers to Japanese Education Ministry. Its role in textbook approval as a barrier to moving away from more revisionist history education in Japan? And how large of a role would you say history education in both countries play in undercutting moving towards improvements in bilateral relations?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I think the education piece is critically important to supporting a process of reconciliation over probably many, many decades. Unfortunately, we have seen, I think, in both countries in recent years, if anything, a kind of hardening of messaging certain kind of national views of historical interpretation and kind of correct views of historical interpretation being more and more kind of filtering into the textbooks and into education. That doesn't mean there's a blanket. I think MEC has a role. The Education Ministry has a role in approving textbooks, but it's the local schools and prefectures that choose the textbooks, and there's a wide range to choose from. The most nationalistic or the most kind of right-wing of interpretations are generally not taught in Japanese schools. As a matter of fact, in both countries, politicians often complain that the teacher unions are infiltrated by the left, and they have the same arguments that we have here in the United States over teaching of history, etc. So that's going to continue, I think. Where I'd like to see that supplemented, personally, I think it comes from the grassroots. It comes from civil society, from NGOs, from people in both countries who get to know each other and desire to understand more about each other and push documentary films or educational exchanges and other kinds of homestays and alternative sources of education that, when I think of growing up myself, I learned about America's history of slavery or treatment of the Native Americans, in part from school, but also very much from other sources outside of school, through documentaries, through programs and projects, and that helped me understand what actually happened in more detail than maybe my grandparents understood, perhaps. So I think it's a constant process of trying to better understand what happened, and then how do you deal with that? But we're never going to get anywhere if both sides are insisting that the other side understand their version of history better.
And Celeste?
Yeah, I want to second Jim's comments and just say I'm deeply concerned by the effort to homogenize perspectives on history in both countries. And when you have controversial issues like historical memory ending up in the courts in defamation lawsuits, or in personal shaming and personal attacks on people of different opinions, or with the denial of funding to scholars who are researching a slightly unconventional or a controversial perspective on history. I think this is deeply troubling, and it's not democratic, to get back to Professor Ha's point, to shut down debate about really controversial issues.
Can I say something about that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, basically agreeing to what the panelist said, the long-term perspective. In other words, when my prediction is that when the Korean Peninsula is unified, and then Japan becomes much more autonomous on their own feet, this controversy will continue. It will never die down. Why? This is both regime postures are very similar and somehow nationalistic in their orientations, and so they need somebody to blame, something to blame on, and so it's a convenient target between the two countries. I mean, both, particularly I think equally, but particularly in Japan, I think the coming back from this kind of totally defeated country dependent upon the United States, rather than diverting their criticism toward the United States. My feeling is that this kind of feelings probably against the United States is kind of being projected upon South Korea. So I really think that this situation will continue until both nations feel confident about their roles and self-perceptions or whatever. So rather than directly resolving this issue when it is not possible, although I don't mean to discount efforts to do so, but I think as Jim said, this kind of spontaneous ground-up level of context between the two countries might be maybe more the relevant or the more fruitful than just flaring up the relationship by defaulting to this kind of politically sensitive issues. I personally stayed in Fukuoka for a number of months, number of years, and I noticed whenever I passed by this kind of railroad station, actually there were Taiwanese, Koreans, Japanese, all mingled together in the morning hours. I found that that's the future of the sort of a regional interaction. So the also perception of Fukuoka people, of the South Korea or Korean people is quite different that of people living in Tokyo or somewhere else. So I already see some regional kind of differentiation about the view of Koreans. So the view was Celeste presented, I appreciate it, but at the same time, I think if you look at the regional the differences within Japan about their perception of South Korea, I guarantee you will find the great variations.
Thank you. And we have one more question about the North Korea factor from Joseph Bosco. So does Japan see the Moon administration's order for closer relationship with DPRK as an impediment to the denuclearization effort?
I think that's certainly part of what drives differences in approach to North Korea, although it's not as much of a factor of as the United States view towards North Korea, at least in the past several years. I mean, it was President Trump's decision to engage really personally with Kim Jong-un. It did, to some extent, for some periods of time, dovetail with President Moon's interest in engaging North Korea. That's obviously been frozen for a little while. So I don't think that's not, I think that Tokyo does think that Moon's approach towards North Korea is somewhat naive, but that is not as much of a factor as the United States decision to engage in negotiations with North Korea. But that's my view. And as I said before, engaging with North Korea makes it all the more hard to come up with trilateral consensus or even trilateral statements about the threat from North Korea.
Can I say something,
Yes.
about following up on the Emma's comments? What I see here, we have why Moon then is trying to, be closer to North Korea, even when he has been misperceived or misunderstood by Japan and the United States. I think when you look at the region-wide kind of level, what you see there is finally China, South Korea, Japan, particularly China and South Korea, they are the ones who successfully industrializing as latecomers. With any latecomer nation as industrializing country, it tend to be nationalistic. They want to project their influence over the region or the world. But South Korea, there's no place to go other than the unification issue. So although there are some critical minded people over Moon Jae-in, the sort of political orientation, if you remember what Kim Young-sam did, there is some similarity between Kim Young-sam and Moon Jae-in, in that Kim Young-sam was boastful of the fact of South Korea's economic success so much that even he went for sort of a 세계화, sort of a internationalization. The ultimately end up being a fiasco, as we all remember. If you look at the Japan case, Japan's industrialization actually unfolded in the context of imperialism. That's how they colonized the Korean Peninsula. But if you look at China, China is a kind of country where they're industrializing in globalization context. So contrary to most of the U.S. scholars' perception of China, to me, China is actually very much quicker than Japan and Korea in accommodating international standards. If you look at the South Korean record, remember the U.S. 1970s, some Congress report, right? Constantly criticizing lack of democracy under Park Chung-hee. Did the democratization occur because of that? I'm sure it affected some intellectuals in South Korea, yes, but then I think that's a time of Cold War period. By putting up a security issue, the sort of Park Chung-hee constantly rebuffed the U.S. demands. But now this is different. So whole point is that rather than focusing some immediate current issues going on in the region, we should have some more historical perspective on where the region is going, where each country is heading for.
Thank you. I think Celeste was expecting this question. This is for Celeste from Hanbin Park. The impact of boycott movement against Japanese products in Korea is still visible. And how does the public opinion influences on this movement?
Thanks. Yeah, I saw the question. It's a good one. When I looked at the coverage of economic data before COVID, it did seem like the boycott movement had a meaningful effect. to get to Jim's point about diversifying ties between the two countries, in particular, South Korean visits to Japan dropped precipitously before COVID hit. I think now the data is complicated by COVID, but the positive signs, I think, from the governments are willingness to open business visas, to loosen the quarantine restrictions between the two countries and things like that, to try to facilitate business relationships. But as I mentioned earlier, the fact that these movements have gotten so much traction in the public sphere and especially have become go-to sources for journalists, and so they get a lot of media coverage, I think further inflames public opinion and makes it difficult to get the kind of clear messaging, forward-looking, or positive messaging about Japan through when there are so many incentives to cover negative statements or inflammatory statements, or as Jim mentioned, if we get different readouts from the working level visits now, I think those then get amplified in the media and worsen public opinion about the other country.
And Yun-Ho, if I could
Yes.
just jump in briefly. I mean, I think, this is a good example of a situation that's worth thinking about. What's the goal? Where are we heading with these kinds of initiatives? Because as someone who talks a lot to both sides, I get the sense that each side really thinks that there's some level of pressure or argument or avenue to get some kind of compromise or agreement from the other side, and I just don't see that happening anytime soon. I mean, we haven't talked about it, but the main Japanese argument against these forced labor cases is not that it didn't happen or that they there weren't bad things about it, and it was the argument that the '65 treaty settled that. So they take it as a very international legal perspective. And of course, the Supreme Court argument that the whole colonization was, the annexation was illegal and illegitimate, runs at a fundamental, cross point to a whole bunch of laws that Japan used to essentially mobilize Korean labor, and they considered Koreans in Korea to be Japanese subjects of the emperor. Etc. So if you really want to go back and try to fix that, I just think that's a recipe for long-term indefinite estrangement between these two very close and important countries. And so I'd rather see efforts at the margins continuing to have that conversation, but to try to figure out ways to build other areas of connection.
Thank you. And Celeste, did you want to add any comment?
I just had a question for the panelists, and Frank Alm raised this in the Q&A, to piggyback on Jim's question about the legitimacy of the 1965 treaty and the claims settlement agreement. Why does the Moon administration refuse to use the arbitration mechanism set up under the agreement?
I don't know whether what I'm going to say is an answer exactly to what Celeste raised. But then, if you look back at 1965, the Korean domestic situation was way different from now. In other words, the Korean democracy is something which is earned by Koreans out of this 1965 situation, domestic situation. So that's why I said at the outset, somehow I am very curious as to how the Japanese, of course there's, the honne and datemae, but I think basically at the honne level, how they think about what has happened politically in South Korea. In other words, to me, I got the sense that they understand, of course, cognitively, but somehow politically, they pretend not to understand it. And then there, I think that the United States has a role to play about this. And so why, I mean, even international legal point of view, the U.S. is probably responsible. If you go back to the San Francisco Peace Treaty, behind the peace treaty, there was negotiation between Japan, the United States, England, and Netherlands. That's the compensation. So then dollars is acknowledged, some compensation to Britain and the Netherlands. So now all this now revealed openly. So not only historically, but also even in terms of legitimacy, I think the U.S. has a legitimate role to play on this question. So that's why I think the history evolves. I mean, simply sticking to the 1965 sort of the legal resolution, then that means that it's closely related to the justification of colonial rule too, actually. Because if you put up the legal facade, there's no human progress. I think we should face up to the changing realities. As I said, that's why leaving these historical questions going along, I mean, or sort of floating until a certain time period, but still we need to continue discussion. And then as Jim said, sort of the local level or the people-to-people level, constant the exchanges should develop so that future generation would have easier time in coming terms with this kind of a difficult history.
Thank you. We just have a couple of minutes, but if you agree, I can take one last question. Will that be okay for all of you? Okay. So we got questions from Paul Tyson and Sung-Hui Kim about Biden's approach to the trilateral relations. And especially Sung-Hui Kim addressed this question to Emma. And the question is, at the end of the U.S. Obama administration, Korea-Japan GSOMIA was signed. Therefore, if Mr. Biden is elected, it could come out in a way that new U.S. administration emphasizes or presses the recovery of GSOMIA. It could be tough for both South Korea and Japan. What's your expectations?
I mean, the GSOMIA, I think, it's not a sideshow. I mean, we became very front and center, but you know, the GSOMIA itself is a very modest agreement. I think South Korea has 12 or 15 other GSOMIAs with other countries with whom they do very little significant security cooperation. But the broader question, I mean, from what we've seen, obviously this campaign has been very dominated by the pandemic and other issues. So the foreign policy outlines we've seen haven't been at the forefront, but there certainly has been attention to restoring alliances that many see as having been somewhat neglected, both the transatlantic and our East Asian alliances during this administration, where Trump very much prefers a different approach. But from what we know of those advising the campaign, that there would be a renewed emphasis on security cooperation among our allies in East Asia, particularly in terms of countering China's more assertive maritime activities, dealing with the North Korean issue. So yes, the GSOMIA may be, part of a package of ways that our allies learn to work together. But it's sort of it would just be part of, I think, a broader approach to how our alliances are handled. And Jim may have other perspectives on this, having worked inside the Pentagon on these issues under a different administration.
Yes, Jim, you're invited to make the last comment.
This is a big responsibility. Well, thank you all for being a part of this and for all the good questions. I guess I would just say that I think watching the Biden campaign, clearly they're focused on rebuilding alliance relationships. They view them as very valuable to U.S. interests. And I think you'd see both in a bilateral context, but also in kind of a multilateral networking of alliances context, a real effort to be made on that front. You have the host nation support agreements that are just outstanding with both countries. And I think they would want to try to get that off the table quickly. And in some ways, maybe that becomes a catalyst. How North Korea behaves, how China behaves is going to be a big factor. But this longer term US competition with China, I think is going to continue. But I think a Biden administration is going to be much more sensitive to how other countries feel about that and what their interests are, and try to work more toward collaborative strategies, because I think they'll view that as being more effective over the long term in blunting certain Chinese aggressions, but also shaping Chinese choices. And ideally, what we want is peace and stability in the region. So that's the goal, and I think these alliances are really important for that.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank all the distinguished speakers and our technical team for putting this together, and thank you all for joining us. And with that, let me conclude today's webinar. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.